Okay, well, let's continue on with different kinds of tests that we could administer. And let's talk a little bit about integrity tests. Now, in the last segment, I had been talking about conscientiousness and how it is one trait that emerges frequently as um, a personality characteristic that predicts performance on the job. A little component of conscientiousness is really how honest and diligent a person is. So we're kind of talking about integrity with that. There are tests available for assessing integrity. So what we're looking at in integrity is predicting whether an employee will engage in counterproductive or dishonest work-related behaviors, cheating, stealing, sabotage, things like that. Now, back in the olden days, companies were allowed to administer lie detector tests to find out whether a person was likely to be dishonest at work or counterproductive. But those were deemed to be illegal. And apparently the only people who can administer it anymore is the government. If you're going for a government job, they still seem to use them, even though lie detector tests or polygraphs are not reliable. They're like 70% accurate, which means a lot of people get accused of lying and being dishonest and being counterproductive when they're not. And a subset of people get granted access to a job that then they cheat, steal, or sabotage. So they're not very accurate. And so psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to develop tests that can accurately predict those kinds of employees who will behave counterproductively or dishonestly at work. There are overt tests, which are tests that will measure attitudes towards theft and actual theft behavior. And these are self-reported. And so if you've ever taken one of these, you might have been asked questions like, have you ever taken home something that belonged at work? And, for honest people, you're like, well, I mean, yeah, I've taken a pencil. I've got, I did take that little handful of paper clips that I used at home. And, you might be thinking about things like that and going, oh, well, yeah, I guess I have. And you're, worried that that's actually going to harm you because you were honest in this overt, attitude scale. Whenever an employer uses this, they have usually a level of responding that they're going to look for. They want to look for a person who's mostly giving responses that indicate honesty and, productivity and things like that. And, an occasional, well, yeah, I took something. Sometimes they'll just ask a question to follow up after you've taken the test. If they're still interested in you, they might say, well, what have you taken from work? And you're like, well, I mean, stationary supplies, things, for writing and stuff. And they're like, that's nothing. If you go, I took a computer, then they're like, wow, okay, never mind. A lot of times I've had a lot of people say to me, well, what am I supposed to say when they ask, have you ever taken anything from work? And I'm like, well, have you? Well, yeah, little things. Well, everybody's taken little things from work. I've got things sitting right here on actually these all right. Some of the stuff I have at home, I'm only using at home because we're on lockdown. I would like to point out I use a lot of things at work that are mine. So I feel like there's a little bit of gray area in my job. I'm just going to say that. I buy a lot of things and use them at work, and I sometimes bring my work stuff home. But see that moment where I'm like, I don't know, am I supposed to be doing this? That's not going to usually harm a person's performance on an overt integrity test. What they're looking for is the overall pattern of, do you think this is okay? So they ask you questions. They'll sometimes give you conceptual questions where it describes an employee doing something. And you're supposed to rate on a scale from 1 to, 1, that's horrible, to 7, I've done that. How much you agree with that behavior. And, you would be looking for the pattern overall in these overt tests. In the personality type integrity test, the idea is we're going to try and use personality characteristics that might predict counterproductive behavior. So we would give a normal personality test and hope that it's kind of masking the intent that what we really are interested in is whether you are likely to behave counterproductively or dishonestly at work. So about 22% of counterproductive behavior is accounted for by these integrity tests, these attempts to establish who's lying or cheating and things like that. About 12% of overall job performance is accounted for by it. And so if you generally have people who are applying for your position who are generally honest people, the risk of possibly offending them or something like that, and they were probably not going to behave counterproductively, but they might have performed really well as an employee. This test isn't going to help you to figure out who might perform well, and it might actually not predict very well the likelihood of counterproductive behaviors. And meanwhile, you might have irritated good applicants, and they don't want to work for you anymore because from the get-go you're suspicious. Now, in certain fields, I think applicants expect it, right? I mean, if you're going into law enforcement or you're going into a job where you actually have access to really expensive things or illicit things that, aren't allowed to be out in the regular world, but they're going to be at work. You can imagine, drug trials and other kinds of things where that might be relevant. Or you have access to proprietary things like computer software or other kinds of things that you don't want getting out. I think a lot of times applicants expect to be screened for integrity. And so they're probably not going to be offended by having to take a test like that. I'm just arguing that like in the typical job, you probably don't need to be including an integrity test. That's what I'm suggesting. All right. So work samples. Work samples are when you actually ask the employee to demonstrate their ability to do the job by giving you a sample of their work. In front of you on the fly. Maybe you send them home with some materials and they're supposed to come back with their solution, things like that. So I'm going to let this little brief video explain it a little bit better, and we'll come back and discuss after that.